Well, hey folks, how you doing today? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Glad to have you here. You know, we had a lot of fun the other day with looking at some of these public comments to the New York Times Pentagon UFO story from about 10 days ago. And I thought it'd just be fun to look at a couple more of these comments because I've got some interesting information to share with you about some of these. So here's one of them. You know, again, as I mentioned in the first video, the Times really did a very good job, I thought, of picking. And we're just looking at the Times picks for reactions to the December 16th article. And they did pick a very fair balance of people, some of whom said they had seen UFOs and some who were extremely skeptical. So continuing on where we were looking last time, Citizen 314, I found this very interesting, said they had seen UFOs 3 times in their life, each about 10 years apart, and they recalled a close encounter from Barcelona in 2001. And they were at a small rooftop gathering with a small gathering of people, and they said they all saw, now they had a couple of beers, but they all saw, 3 of them saw this huge, half a football field sized, boomerang-shaped UFO hovering over the center of the city, just a few hundred yards away from where they were looking at. And this person mentioned that, now the boomerang-shaped UFO, you have to keep in mind, was seen over the Hudson Valley in New York State, New Jersey area, Connecticut in the 1980s. I mean, tens of thousands of people saw that object. I've spoken to 3 myself, and I did write about it in my Black Swan Ghosts book. But thousands of people saw that object. Now, this person, Citizen 314, says that they saw the footage from the Phoenix lights in 1997, but they didn't believe them. They thought they were fake until they saw the same sort of object over Barcelona. And the ship that they saw right there in Barcelona, they said, their jaws dropped because the ship started moving upwards and squished down into a sphere-shaped ball. Now, isn't that incredible sounding? Many people have described these shape-shifting UFOs, some of the triangular UFOs, as we've learned from David Marler's book, Triangular UFOs. They can shapeshift, and this is what this person saw. Now, I'm not surprised that people have written into the Times saying they've seen things, because I've encountered many more witnesses than I would expect, and this is what I wrote about in Black Swan Ghosts. Now, this is a very interesting comment, I thought, from Thomas in Salt Lake City, Utah. He says, it may be worthwhile to spend a modest amount on the program to collect and analyze data related to apparent observations of aerial phenomena that have no obvious immediate explanation. And whether 7 million a year is appropriate may be subject to debate. However, the warning flag comes out with the mention of Harold Puthoff of remote viewing notoriety. It was associated even remotely with this Department of Defense project. He says the Skeptical Inquirer has had many articles over the years, and Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were associated with illusionist Uri Geller. And so so Thomas really doubts this whole thing because of the association of the DoD UFO program and Harold Puthoff. But let me tell you something. First of all, I wasn't there when Targ and Puthoff were studying Uri Geller. I was told personally by Russell Targ of all the stringent controls that were put into place, Uri Geller being strapped down to a chair, the door being locked shut, a Faraday cage around the whole room. He was still able to bend objects in another room. So I wasn't there at the time. But I can tell you, I've been uncategorically told by a former Department of Defense official, retired now, that the United States was monitoring Soviet PK psychokinesis experiments, or as it's called, anomalous perturbation. The United States was monitoring a 1976 PK experiment, and a Soviet PK practitioner was able to bend a spoon at the distance of 1,000 miles. Now, this is not a fact because it wasn't published. I don't think it's classified anymore, or this person wouldn't have told me this, but it was never published or talked about outside of the people that were aware of this program. Luckily, this person felt safe enough telling me about it. But I can tell you from the status of this person who told me this that I'm 100% confident that this event happened. So for me, PK is settled science, even though, unfortunately, it's not in the scientific realm, and maybe at some point this data will be released and we can all talk about it more openly. But here's the main point about Thomas's comet. There are about 100 years of good remote viewing ESP telepathy experiments, and as far as I'm concerned, that is settled science, because there is so much research done on telepathy, ESP, remote viewing, precognition, and related phenomena. The significance of these studies is generally 5 to 6 sigma, which is on the order of millions or billions to one that these results could be by chance. And you don't have to take my word for it. The research that was initially done by Targ and Puthoff was published in the science journal Nature in 1974. Information transmission under conditions of sensory shielding, right? How is this information transmitted? Now, Nature is a peer-reviewed journal. Thomas is mentioning Skeptical Inquirer. That's not a peer-reviewed journal. There's no scientific merit to something like that. It has to be peer-reviewed, and we all have to be able to look at the data and come to a conclusion about it. But Nature did publish this article, so there is scientific evidence for ESP. Maybe some of the early studies done in the 1920s and the 1930s were not done as well as they would be now. Obviously, we use double-blind conditions, controls, randomized samples, and that wouldn't have been done 100 years ago. But the studies have gotten better and better and better, and they're now, ESP studies are some of the best done scientific research ever to have been done because people are so critical and skeptical of it, and that's why it's done so carefully. And so the studies that are done now are probably done to a much higher standard than even many other scientific studies. I mean, you have to consider that when pharmaceuticals publish their results, they typically only get a 2 or 3 sigma result. That would mean being 95% confident or 99% confident in your study. But here, the ESP studies, you have orders of 5 and 6 sigma levels of statistical confidence. And I can tell you this as a former statistics teacher, that's pretty impressive. But after Targ and Puthoff, when the remote viewing program was declassified in 1995, Congress wanted to know, if the program had produced useful results. And Jessica Utz, PhD in statistics, was hired to research this. And through the American Institute for Research, she published the so-called AIR report. And in this report, she told us that from the studies she had looked at, that there was no doubt that ESP was a real phenomenon. I mean, just look at the conclusions that she wrote in the AIR report. It is clear to this author that anomalous cognition, another name for ESP, the scientific name perhaps, is possible and has been demonstrated. This conclusion is not based on belief, but rather on commonly accepted scientific criteria. The phenomena has been replicated in a number of forms across laboratories and cultures. The various experiments in which it has been observed have been different enough that if some subtle methodological problems can explain the results, then there would have been different explanation for each type of experiment, yet the impact would have been similar. Here we have someone who really was the former president of the American Statistical Association this year, 2017. She would be the highest ranked statistician on the planet, and she says remote viewing in ESP is real. Now, in response to Thomas's comments here in the New York Times, we had none other than Fred Atwater, known to us as Skip Atwater. This was one of the individuals that set up the remote viewing program in the government in the early 1970s. Now, Skip writes here, using the Skeptical Inquirer magazine as a reference for anything completely undermines your argument. No, thank you, Skip. The Skeptical Inquirer is like the National Enquirer, except that it's suitable for entertainment purposes. But it's hardly a reliable scientific source. By contrast, Puthoff and Targ published their work in Nature, one of the top science journals in the world. So this is a very good point, is ESP research has been documented again and again. Now, if you find it hard to believe that people have natural telepathic ability. You're not alone. I didn't believe in this either. In the early in the 1990s, when I came across this concept. I mean, as a former statistics teacher, I didn't believe that the average person had any remote viewing ability, telepathic ability. I thought maybe special people did for some unknown reason. But I was wrong. It really did work. I took a class at the Farsight Institute with Dr. Courtney Brown of Emory University. He had studied fractals and chaos theory like I had. And so to me, that was sort of interesting. Someone with similar interests, and here's this topic of remote viewing. I took the class as a skeptic, and I found out that within a few days, everyone was getting results in the class. I got some results myself, which were very hard to explain. Extremely accurate descriptions of a target picture that was hidden from me, wouldn't be shown until after the session was done. We're all separated and by in different desks. You can't see what other people are doing. So I found the results convincing, and later I found out the statistics also are convincing, just like Jessica Utz is telling us here. Now, you need to know that originally the Department of Defense got interested in remote viewing not to do it. They were concerned that the Soviet Union had psychics that were spying on American military and intelligence facilities. I mean, you can imagine their concern if people thousands of miles could be looking through your military, looking through your files, observing military installations, and the like. So the initial intent of the remote viewing research was to disprove it. The original purpose of the remote viewing program was to disprove it. They didn't want it to be real. They didn't believe it would work. And so the Department of Defense and the other intelligence agencies hired Targ and Puthoff to find out if this was real or not. And that's how Ingo Swann and later Pat Price got involved in the remote viewing program at Stanford Research Institute, as was known in the 1970s. The initial intent was to disprove remote viewing, but they couldn't because it worked. Ingo Swann showed that it worked, and so did Pat Price in some really amazing initial remote viewing sessions, viewing distant targets, which really blew the minds of the people at the CIA and the Department of Defense, because no one expected it to work that well. It actually frightened them. You can read Russell Targ's book, The Reality of ESP, and he discusses some of these he goes through the history of the program, and right in the beginning of the book, he describes all the different places where remote viewing and similar phenomena were studied. At Princeton, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, where Robert John and Brenda Dunn did many, many research studies of micro PK, which is influencing a random number generator with your mind, which they found positive results for. But just for RV itself, they got odds of billions to one that this was by chance, using people randomly going to distant targets and having the viewer back in the lab describing what the remote outbounder was seeing at the time. William Broad and Marilyn Schlitz did studies in 1970s and 80s on distant mental influence, which Marilyn published in her book, Distant Mental Influence. Gonsfield studies, where someone basically is looking at a blank screen and they're attempting to see what a friend of theirs might be looking at in another room. Again, odds of finding these results by chance were 1 in a billion. And Darrell Bem did a 5-year study at Cornell University with 9 precognition experiments and looking at a phenomenon that we call retrocausality, whether something that's going to happen in the future influences you now. And again, he got odds of billions to 1 against chance that these are just spurious results. Now, if you reject these results, you don't have to accept it, but then you're in danger of committing what we call a type 2 statistical error, which is rejecting real results. And I'm convinced that this is, again, settled science at this point, that these are real results. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy to explain necessarily why this could be happening. I think this has to do a little bit with a multidimensional approach to how the universe works. And I published this in an article recently. You can see here, Edge Science from the Society for Scientific Exploration. But you can make your own mind up why this could work. I think the evidence shows that it does work. Now, as Stephen Schwartz points out in the foreword to Russell Targ's book, The Reality of ESP, A Physicist's Proof of Psychic Abilities, Hyman, who was hired as the critic to the RV program, as the skeptic, you have to keep in mind, Utz came to her conclusions completely objectively. She didn't necessarily want to believe in the phenomena or not. She just wanted to look at the evidence, and she was convinced that the evidence showed statistically that the phenomena is real. And even Hyman, who was a skeptic, said, I want to state that we agree on many points, he and Jessica. We both agree that the experiments were free of methodological weaknesses that plagued the early research. We also agree that the experiments appear to be free of the more obvious and better known flaws that can invalidate the results of parapsychological investigation. And we agree that the effect sizes reported are too large and consistent to be dismissed as statistical flukes. So even Hyman is agreeing here that the data show that the phenomena is real. He just disagreed whether we can explain it, and he didn't think, if you read his full response, that you can have a phenomena that doesn't have a scientific explanation. So if that's your problem with it, fine. We don't necessarily know what explains it, but I think the data show quite convincingly that it's real. I found this when I started teaching this myself at my Mount Baldy Institute. I mean, if you just take a look at these, these are typically the results that you find in RV. This is the, these are typically the results that you find in RV. I mean, here is a typical training target, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and here's what the viewer was able to draw, which is very, I think you'd have to agree, a very accurate drawing of this hidden target picture. Here you have a kind of a tower-shaped object that's leaning. They have a dome or a higher structure on this building in the background. Now, they didn't see it from our same camera angle view that we're seeing it here, but if you've been to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, or you look online, you see there are mountains in the background, two hills. And so, very accurate session. You often get these in remote viewing training sessions. I call it resonant viewing, but whatever you want to call it. The viewer is resonating with the target and able to describe it very well. I mean, here is a target, kind of a fun target. Someone gave us a picture of this kind of secret photo from Area 51, the area called S4. And here you can see that this was the target. You can see the hangars. It's very, obviously it's far away from the camera, and these MiG planes are in front that they test out there, to see how they work. And look what the viewer was able to draw, these hangar-like structures with the dark openings and planes in front, just like in the target here. Now, what did she know ahead of time? Zero. I hadn't spoken to her in a couple of weeks. I called her up. I said, hey, would you like to do a RV session? She said, sure. I faxed her some random numbers that are just put on the top of the folder with this picture. Random numbers, that's it. It's all the viewer gets. And she was able to do this really well. So this is what people have seen for years. Now, if you want another really heavy-duty book on the science behind remote viewing, this is a recent book, Anomalous Cognition, by Ed May and Sonali Marwaha. Ed ran the program after Targ and Puthoff were no longer in charge at SRI, and he later did this at SAIC. And he came to similar conclusions. Look at some of these examples from the viewer Joe McMonagle. These types of targets, an outbounder is selected to go to a random location. All they were told in this case of the Altamont Pass wind turbines is that there's an outbounder somewhere in the United States at a target location. Describe it. Totally blind circumstances. And here the Joe McMonagle is able to do a very good job, you can see, drawing these wind turbines. He even says, making electricity in the form of grid work, power poles. And then the little, where the rotors spin around the wind turbines, he says, probably a halo not visible to the eye because it's spinning around so fast. Really quite incredible. Here's another session at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Again, someone is sent to a random location. The viewer is back in a room somewhere, and they're just told to describe where the outbounder is. Look at this West Gate of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Again, Joe McMonagle, first viewer for the Army program back in the 70s. He gets the shape of the building, almost 100% correct. Parking lot, row of trees, many small buildings around. He writes parking lot. So these are the sorts of results that convince scientists that RV is real. Sessions that are done under very controlled circumstances. And the results typically are, in Ed May's study, the results, about 15% of the RV sessions were as good as the ones you just saw here. Very good. It's very clear that the viewer made contact with something. There's no other way to interpret it. And Ed, I mean, in this book, they conclude right at the back of the book. The conclusions from this 35-plus year research effort can be summarized as following. 1, ESP exists. 2, the gradient of Shannon entropy is the key factor influencing information transfer, which just means that the more so-called entropy you have at the target site, the easier it is for the viewer. The more difference and larger gradients of color and shapes and sizes you have at the target makes it easier for the viewer to perceive it. 3, because of the innate nature of the ability, the phenomena so far resist training for excellence. He doesn't believe that you can be trained to do this better than you can already do it. And the evidence for PK is questionable. But in any case, I think you can see that the conclusions from people who've studied this are that the phenomena is real. Now, my initial encounter with remote viewing back in 1996, I mean, I found it so astounding that this was a real phenomena, given that I had been skeptical of it, that I ended up writing a book about it called Opening Minds. And if you're interested, you can see more targets like this in Opening Minds and many other people's remote viewing books, where the viewer was able to very accurately draw a hidden target picture that they had no access to and didn't see the target picture until they were done with their session. And if you've been around this phenomena, it's quite astounding, and that's why I've been involved with it for about 20 years now. Now, if you don't want to believe in it, fine. I mean, you don't have to, but you have to ask yourself what evidence would convince you. What do you think of as evidence? Would it be your science teacher telling you it's real? Again, the New York Times, like they did with this UFO article. I mean, what would convince you that this phenomena is real? Because as far as I'm concerned, the science says and shows that it's real. We all have some small ability. Some people it's much bigger, but for most people it's a very faint but consistent ability to perceive distant information. And maybe you've all experienced this at times when you get kind of gut feelings or intuitions about things that later turn out to be accurate. But in any case, the science shows that it's real and that we're all kind of connected to this hidden channel of information in a way that modern science hasn't yet successfully explained. As I've mentioned, if you look at it from a many worlds interpretation or a multiverse interpretation, the idea of parallel realities, maybe that's some explanation. But whatever works for you, don't say that there's no evidence for it, because there's plenty of evidence. It's just that you probably haven't taken time to look at the evidence, and that's the difference, okay? And it's similar to this UFO topic. A lot of people say there's no evidence. There are 70 years of evidence. You probably haven't taken time to look at it. I mean, just as an example, I personally went to the citizen hearing on disclosure in 2013 at the National Press Club, organized by the Paradigm Research Group. We listened for 5 full days to 40 witnesses, some of whom were excellent witnesses, pilots and FAA flight controllers, FAA officials, nuclear missile launch control officers, and folks of that stature, highly qualified to talk about what they've seen and observed. That's evidence. The evidence does exist. I can't help it if the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't report very much about the citizen hearing, but I was there for 5 days, as were the witnesses and the retired members of Congress and Senate who listened to this testimony. So the evidence is there. It's just a question of whether we're willing to look at it. And thankfully, the New York Times did look at some evidence for the UFO phenomena. Hopefully we'll see more of it. The evidence is there. It's a question of whether you actually want to take the time to look at it or not. And finally, we have another comment here. There were some comments, people saying, $22 million, isn't that a waste of money? We could be feeding hungry children. Listen, We're talking about aircraft safety here. If there are objects that nobody knows about that are flying near our airports, just like happened at the Chicago O'Hare International Airport in November of 2016, where an object was seen by over 25 United employees. There are some photos of the object. You can see some of these in YouTube videos. And they were told not to talk about it. So you have objects that are right near airports, and we don't know what these objects are, and no one's talking about it. And the FAA, when they're approached, are very dismissive of these, and the employees are too scared to talk about it. Again, something I mentioned in Black Swan Ghosts, because I found that people are afraid to talk about this topic. I mean, how many other witnesses are out there? And also, by the way, $22 million, that's about a half a day of what the Pentagon spends on fuel alone. So it's not all that much. Especially for a serious topic like this, where we need to find out more what's going on. Now, here's a very interesting discussion. Here's another interesting comment. This is from Richard Conn Henry, and he says that Jimmy Carter, as president, asked NASA for an investigation of UFOs, and he was the deputy director for NASA at the time in the astrophysics division, and he was involved in the response. And he said, I'd always been interested in UFOs as well, not just swamp gas, but we deflected it. Oh, what a surprise. UFOs have calmed down subsequently, but I sort of wish that we'd look more into this Carter sighting, and he strongly supports an open mind on the subject. Well, thank you, Henry. Now we have a response here from none other than James Oberg, who's been in the media recently. James says that Carter's notorious sighting seems to have been adequately explained as a NASA barium launch from Eglin Air Force Base. Too bad NASA couldn't have told him that years ago. Okay, so maybe Carter did see a barium rocket launch. I don't know what Carter saw. But the point is, even many of the government studies of this phenomenon have always told us that 5% can't be explained. Even if 95% of what people see does have an explanation, it's that remaining 5% that shows us that there's a real phenomenon. The Cometa report in France, conducted by their own defense establishment, came to the same conclusion. So about 5% can't be explained with any adequate explanation, and that's what we're looking at here. Again, as I mentioned in the previous video, even though many swans are white, that doesn't mean that there aren't black swans, and you'd be making a mistake if just because all you've seen are white swans that there aren't black swans. I used the example of the fall of the Berlin Wall as an example. I mean, events that are rare still happen, and in the case of the Berlin Wall, just someone muddling a date, the East German official who wasn't sure when the visitation program would begin for citizens of East Germany, he just made something up. He said it starts today. That led to news reports and people storming the wall, and the wall really fell down. So just because you can explain some of these sightings doesn't mean that the rest of them don't deserve an explanation. I would say that this F-18 footage from the Nimitz 2004, as we've heard from Chris Mellon when he discussed it at the To the Stars Academy event a couple months ago, they can explain what these are. If the Department of Defense doesn't know what these objects are, who does? Okay. So anyway, I thought you'd enjoy this a little bit. Thanks again for watching. Keep an open mind. We'll talk to you soon. Take care for now. And